In this video, we're going to speak about the anatomy of the heart and blood flow through the heart. Heart is a hollow muscular organ that pumps oxygen, poor blood to the lungs through the network of blood vessels, and then from the lungs picks up oxygen and it becomes oxygen-rich blood, and the oxygen-rich blood comes back to the heart, and then heart pumps this oxygen-rich blood throughout the body, again through some network of blood vessels, and then gas exchange occurs. So we're going to look at this in details. Before we look at it, let's look at the heart. Heart can consist of basically 4 chambers. You have 2 upper chambers, right atrium and then left atrium right over here, and then you have 2 lower chambers, and the 2 lower chambers are your right ventricle and left ventricle right around this region. We're going to look at it in details in a second. The right and the upper chamber, so those 2 chambers over here are separated from those 2 chambers that's here by valves that's called atrioventricular valve. So you have set of valves right over here, which we could consider it like a door, and this one is valves over here, which is doors. This valves, which is called tricuspid valve, separates right atrium from right ventricle, and this valves over here called bicuspid valves separates left atrium from left ventricle. The tip of the heart right over here is called apex. The heart is surrounded by pericardial cavity. Pericardial cavity is basically a membrane that's filled with the fluid, and pericardial, this cavity right over here is called pericardial cavity and is filled with the fluid. The pericardial cavity itself consists of, basically has 2 membranes. One membrane is right over here, that's one, the inner membrane that attaches the surface of the heart, and then you have this membrane which is touching the surface of the chest, so that's visceral membrane and parietal membrane. There are 2 circuits that the blood flows through the heart. So before I go to explain it, I'm gonna draw a very simplified model. So let's assume that this one is right atrium and this one is left atrium, this one is right ventricle over here, and this one is left ventricle. So you have left ventricle, right atrium, and left atrium. We're going to look at those and we're going to see how the blood flows from place to place. So from the right ventricle, the blood is pumped to the lungs. The lungs, some kind of gas exchange occurs at the lungs, and from the lungs, the blood comes back to the heart. And then what happens is the heart pumps the blood. So I'm going to change the color. So the red one, let's assume that the red one is our pulmonary circuit, and I'm going to choose the green. So the heart pumps the blood to the peripheral tissue, and from peripheral tissue, the blood comes back to the lungs. So you see 2 circuits. One is the red, from heart to the lungs and back to the heart, and the second one is green, from heart to the peripheral tissue and back to the heart. So the green one is called systemic circuit, and the red one is called pulmonary circuit. Let's look at the pulmonary circuit in more details. In pulmonary circuit, what happens is that you have right over here, so let me change the color to red so you could see it. So this is the right ventricle. The right ventricle basically pumps the blood through the semilunar valve, that's aortic semilunar valve, pumps the blood to the aorta, pulmonary artery. So pulmonary right ventricle pumps the blood to the pulmonary artery, and pulmonary artery will branch into left and right, and deliver blood to the left and right lungs. So the blood is going to basically move, and now the blood is going to get right over here at the lungs. What is going to happen at the lungs? Some kind of gas exchange is going to occur. So in that gas exchange, you have alveoli. So this blood vessel basically comes right this way. Oxygen from the alveoli is going to diffuse into the capillary. Carbon dioxide from the capillary is going to diffuse to the alveoli. And then this blood is going to become oxygen-rich blood. And this blood is going to be delivered back to the heart. So both sides, this is going to happen. So oxygen is going to diffuse from the alveoli to the capillaries, and CO2 is going to diffuse from the capillaries to the alveoli. Let's look at this in more detail. So let's say that this is the blood vessel right over here. Right, so this is the blood vessel. So this blood vessel brings the blood from the heart. Now, right over here, you have alveoli. And you breathe in fresh air. So when you breathe in fresh air, that fresh air has oxygen. And the concentration of oxygen in that fresh air is comparatively high. This blood that comes over here has very low concentration of oxygen. So at this point, what happens is obviously oxygen will diffuse from high concentration to low concentration. So oxygen is going to move from the alveoli to the capillaries. Now this blood that came over here also had high concentration of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from here to the alveoli, and then you breathe out. So you breathe in fresh air, and this blood is going to keep moving. So right over here, this blood that came, this was oxygen poor blood, which is deoxygenated. Now this oxygen became what? Oxygen rich blood. So oxygen poor blood comes and becomes oxygen rich blood after that gas exchange. Now after the gas exchange, the blood moves. So the blood came over here. Now the blood moves this way. So remember, I used the blue color. The blue color basically represents the oxygen poor blood. So if I use the blue color, this blood was oxygen poor up to here. And now after the gas exchange, it became oxygen rich. So the blood came over here as oxygen poor, gas exchange occur. Now this blood is oxygen rich. That oxygen rich blood is going back to the heart. So pulmonary veins from the left and right lung will collect the blood, and the blood is now moving. So the blood is going to move to the left atrium. So now the blood is going to reach the left atrium. At the left atrium, the blood is going to pass through the left ventricle. But before we move to that one, so the summary of the pulmonary. So from the right ventricle goes to the pulmonary artery, goes to the lungs. Gas exchange occurs, goes back to the pulmonary veins, and then it goes to the left atrium. Now, from the left atrium, the blood is going to pass to the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, the blood is going to move to the aorta, passing through the aortic semilunar valve. So this circle that you see over here is the semilunar valve. So systemic circulation basically provides the functional blood supply to all the body tissue. It carries oxygen and nutrients to the cell throughout the body, and then picks up carbon dioxide and brings it back to the lungs. So this oxygenated blood now moves to the aorta. As it moves to the aorta will transport this, and it will branch to different arteries. So it's going to go to the carotid artery, subclavian artery. It will go down to descending aorta, and then it will branch into, go to the kidneys, go to the intestine, go to the lower limbs, and so forth. So basically, as this aorta goes down, it will branch and eventually deliver blood to the entire cells. Now, this blood is going to get to the organs and cells and tissue, and there's some kind of gas exchange is going to occur again. What is that gas exchange? Oxygen is going to diffuse from the capillaries to the cell, and CO2 is going to diffuse from the cell to the capillaries. Let's look at it. So here is the blood. So let's say that this blood came from the heart and it has oxygen. Obviously, concentration of oxygen is high here. So this is very oxygenated blood. And right over here, I have the cell. And the cell has mitochondria over here. So mitochondria, the function of mitochondria is to produce energy. So what does the mitochondria do? Mitochondria consumes oxygen. So my mitochondria constantly consumes oxygen. And in addition to oxygen, it consumes some kind of organic molecule. So organic molecule and oxygen is consumed. So where does this oxygen comes from? So this blood that came over here is going to diffuse, the oxygen is going to diffuse to the interstitial fluid. So basically interstitial fluid is this place right over here is filled with the fluid in between the cells. So that's my interstitial fluid. So the oxygen is going to move from here and into the interstitial fluid. From the interstitial fluid, the oxygen is going to diffuse into the cell. Once it diffuses into the cell will consume that oxygen, use that oxygen. And when it uses the oxygen, in exchange, it produces energy. So this cell will produce ATP. In addition to ATP, the cell will produce carbon dioxide. And now what is going to happen? This carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from the cell to the interstitial fluid and from the interstitial fluid to the capillaries. And this blood is going to go back to the heart. So oxygenated blood came and now became deoxygenated blood. So oxygen-rich blood came, became oxygen-poor blood. So after the gas exchange, the blood is basically collected by superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. So the blood from all the upper part and lower part goes to the superior and inferior vena cava, and superior and inferior vena cava will pump the blood to the right atrium. And then obviously we discussed that from right atrium and it's going to go to the right ventricle. Right ventricle is going to pump it back to the lungs, is going to go to the lungs, pick up oxygen, come back to the heart. From the heart is going to go to the cells, give the oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide, come back to the heart. Heart is going to pump it back to the lungs. Lungs going to give it oxygen, take the carbon dioxide, send it back to the heart. So that's how basically it goes. Let's look at the cross section of the heart. So we now basically cut the heart. We could see the four chambers. So you see the right atriums right over here. So the two upper chamber in a cross section. So right atrium receives blood from superior and inferior vena cava. So right atrium receives blood from superior and inferior vena cava. Superior vena cava collects blood from head, neck, upper limbs, and chest and brings it to the right atrium. Inferior vena cava collects blood from the trunk, viscera, and lower limbs and brings it to the right atrium. So left atrium, on the other hand, receives blood from the right and left pulmonary veins. So right and left pulmonary veins deliver blood right through this one and brings it to the left atrium. Now we have the two ventricles that you see over here, right ventricle and left ventricle. So those are the two lower chambers. Ventricles have muscular bumps right over here. So when you look at the ventricles, you're going to see tiny muscles right over here. And those muscles are called trabeculae carinae. Trabeculae carinae is basically those muscles that you have it right over here. Now, the papillary muscles are basically right over here. You have strings, tiny strings that's called chordae tendineae, it's heart strings. And right over here you have these tiny strings. Those are attached, those tiny strings are attached to the papillary muscles. So what is their function? When the ventricles contract, the chordae tendineae, basically the muscles contract to pull the chordae tendineae, to pull those tiny strings, these ones, to pull those strings and prevent the valves from swinging backward to open this way. Why is that important? So that the valves don't open backward and the blood from here doesn't flow back to the atriums. So what is the function of chordae tendineae? The chordae tendineae prevent valves from swinging backward. And what is the function of the valves? To prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricles back to the atria. Now, right over here, so this valves over here is located between the right atrium and right ventricle. So those valves basically serve as a door. Whenever the atriums receive blood, those valves are closed. When the atriums are filled with the blood, when the atriums contract, the door opens, the blood flows from the atrium to the ventricle. And when the ventricle contracts, this door again closes so that the blood could flow this way. So this shows you right over here the tricuspid valve. And basically the function of it to prevent the backflow of blood. So the blood should not go back this way. The blood should only go back this way. So when this door is closed, when the valves are closed, the blood will have no choice but to go this way. And to strengthen, to enforce the closure of this valves so that the valves doesn't swing backward, what we said? We said the cusps of these valves are attached to tiny strings, and those strings are called chordae tendineae. And then chordae tendineae is attached to muscle, papillary muscles. So those papillary muscles contract and prevent them. Now, bicuspid valve, right over here, is located between left atrium and left ventricle. So left ventricle and left atrium, between them, that door or valve is called a bicuspid valve. And bicuspid valves are also called mitral valves. So this is the bicuspid. So the function is to prevent the blood from going this way. So it prevents blood from going from the left ventricle back to the left atrium. So the blood should only move to the aorta. So the blood will move to the aorta but not backward. Again, to strengthen those valves so that the valves don't swing backward, the cusps of those valves are attached to what? Chordae tendineae, and then chordae tendineae is attached to the papillary muscle, and that gives it further reinforcement. Now, in addition to this one, you have pulmonary semilunar valves. So those valves over here is pulmonary semilunar valve. And what is the function of this one? The function of this one is that they close when the ventricle receives blood. And when the ventricle contracts, they open so that the blood could go to the left and right pulmonary artery. So it goes to the right and left pulmonary artery. So that's the function of the pulmonary semilunar valve. And that's where it's shown. So this is the pulmonary semilunar valve. Now you have the aortic semilunar valve. So aortic semilunar valve right over here, it basically controls the flow of blood from the left ventricle to the aorta. So through the aorta, when the blood flows, that blood is controlled by, the flow is controlled by the aortic semilunar valve. So whenever the ventricle, left ventricle, receives blood from the atrium, this valve is closed. This door is locked, closed. And when the blood comes to the ventricle, when the ventricle is filled with the blood, this door closes too. So atrioventricular valves close too. Now the ventricles contract, and that contraction increases the pressure, and the pressure will force this door to open. And when this door is open, the semilunar valves open, the blood will flow from the ventricle to the aorta. And right over here shows you the valve. Now we're going to look at the flow of the blood. So basically, superior vena cava and inferior vena cava brings the blood to the right atrium. So the blood comes right over here and fills the right atrium. So when the blood comes to the right atrium will contract. So initially when it receives the blood, this door is closed. And this door is the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve is closed. This fills with the blood. And when this fills with the blood, the atrium begins to contract. When it begins to contract, this forces this door to open. So when the door is open, the blood will empty. So this is going to become empty and the blood will flow into the ventricle. So now the blood is moving to the ventricle and this guy becomes empty. So there's going to be no blood here. All the blood moves from here to the ventricle. Now, when the blood gets to the ventricle, this door closes back. Now, this door is closed. Remember, this door is closed. This is the pulmonary semilunar valve. And this door is going to be closing too. Now, at this point, the ventricle will contract. It will just squeeze. As it squeezes, what is going to happen? The pressure inside the ventricle will increase. As the pressure increases, this increased pressure will force this door to open. So the door will open and the blood will flow into the pulmonary arteries. So the blood is now flowing to the left and right pulmonary arteries. The right and left pulmonary arteries will take the blood to the lungs. So this is going to go, and I'm going to draw this one. Let's put it from this side. It will go, and they will go to the left and right lungs. So right over here's the lungs. At the lungs, gas exchange is going to occur. After the gas exchange, the blood is going to be collected by the pulmonary veins. And pulmonary veins will take this blood and deliver it back to the lungs. And now the blood is right over here in the pulmonary veins. And this pulmonary veins brought the blood back in. So now you see this blood is after the gas exchange. So remember, after this gas exchange, the blood became oxygenated. This blood was deoxygenated. So it was deoxygenated blood. Now this blood is oxygenated. This oxygenated blood goes. So right over here, you see this blood is now oxygenated. From left and right lung, the blood comes to the left atrium. So right over here is the left atrium. The blood is going to come to the left atrium. So now the blood is in the left atrium. So the function of left atrium is basically to receive blood from the left and right pulmonary veins. And remember, at this point, this bicuspid valves are closed when the atriums receive blood. So this valve is closed. No blood is going to come to the ventricle. Once the atrium received all the blood, the atrium will contract. Contraction of the atrium will force, let me change the color so you could see it. The contraction of the atrium will force the blood to come from the atrium to the ventricle. Now the blood is in the left ventricle. The left ventricle, when it's filled with the blood, this door is going to close again. That's the bicuspid valve. This door is already closed. That's the semilunar valve, aortic semilunar valve. So both doors are closed. Now what is going to happen? The ventricle is going to contract. And as the ventricle contracts, the pressure inside the ventricle will keep going up and up and up. So if this one is pressure in the aorta and this is pressure initially in the ventricle, as contraction occurs, the pressure is going to go up, up, up. Whenever the pressure in the ventricle is more than the pressure in the aorta, the aortic semilunar valve will open. Once it opens, the blood is gonna flow out of the ventricle and is gonna enter the aorta. So the ascending portion of the aorta basically will receive blood and it will branch into the brachiocephalic trunk right over here. So it will branch to the brachiocephalic trunk, and then it will branch into the carotid artery, and then it will branch into the subclavian artery right over here. So 3 branches gonna go: subclavian artery and carotid artery and brachiocephalic artery. So brachiocephalic artery, carotid artery, and left subclavian artery. And then the blood is going to go down, keep going down through the ascending, descending aorta, and it will branch and basically deliver blood. So it's going to just go, keep going left and right, and eventually right over here between the cell and the capillaries, gas exchange is going to occur, and oxygen is going to basically diffuse from the capillaries to the cell, and carbon dioxide from the cell is going to diffuse to the capillaries, and then this blood is going to go back through the superior and inferior vena cava back to the heart. So it will just basically end up where we started. So that shows you the flow of the blood. Now, in addition that the heart has to supply blood to the other organs and systems, there's one more thing. Heart itself should receive blood supply, and that's called coronary circulation. It's supply of the blood to the muscle tissue of the heart. So what do you have as that coronary arteries originate in the sinus. So right over here, this is basically the aorta. So you see this one is the aorta. Right before aorta delivering blood to any other organ. So remember, the aorta will deliver blood to other organs and kind of like descend down here, and it's going to go down this way. So before it goes anywhere, there is a blood vessel that's separating, and that blood vessel is basically supplying blood to the heart itself. So you see the heart cells itself receive the blood. So you have the right coronary arteries that supply blood to the right atrium and portion of both ventricle. And then you have the left coronary arteries, and the left coronary arteries supply blood to the left ventricle and the left atrium and ventricular septum. So if you look at the heart from different view, that's the coronary supply. With this, we're going to conclude the video. See you for the next video.